one of my least favorite things to do is applying for a job. I don't like to use the word hate, but I hate that whole process. I don't like applications. I don't like resumes. I don't like cover letters. I don't like interviews. I don't like any of it. However, as much as I dislike that whole process of looking for jobs, it is kind of fun and it's kind of interesting to me, at least, to peruse job ads, to look at job ads. Do you ever do that? Sometimes I'll look at job ads that I'm not really interested in personally for myself. I'm just kind of curious of the details of what it takes. What kind of education do you have to have, and what kind of requirements need to be met in order for you to be a commercial airline pilot? What kind of experience do you need to be a construction project manager? What kind of certificates do you need to have in order to be an accountant? Those types of things. I like to look at job ads. It's weird, I know. And as you look at job ads, you'll notice real quickly that in nearly every job listing, there's two categories. There's qualifications and duties. So qualifications, those are the specific conditions or requirements that need to be met in order for you to be considered for that job. And usually these qualifications, they're going to be necessary for you to fulfill the duties of that job as well. So for instance, in order to be a doctor, one of the qualifications is that you need to have an advanced medical degree from a recognized educational institution, right? I mean, personally, I don't know about you, but personally, I don't want my doctor, the person working on me, to have gotten their medical degree from a 3-week intensive course at the convention center. That's not what I want. You want them to be qualified. You want them to be qualified to do the job. So qualifications, those are the conditions. Those are the prerequisites, the requirements that need to be met in order for the applicant to be considered for the job. So in order to be a long-haul truck driver, you need to have a commercial driver's license. In order to be a legal security guard, you need to be licensed with DPSST. Those are qualifications. And that second category that we see often in job listings is duties. Duties are those things that you're going to be required to do as part of your job. So when looking at the list of duties, what you need to ask yourself is, can I do that, right? So for instance, one of the duties of being a heating and air conditioning installer is that you're able to fit into tight places. So obviously I'm out. I can't do that job. That was a joke. Maybe in order to work in a manufacturing plant, you need to be able to stand on your feet for 12 hours a day and do repetitive movements. Those are duties, things that you have to do in order to fulfill the job. So qualifications, those are the requirements, the conditions that qualify you for a job, and duties are those things that you have to do in order to fulfill that job. Now, when we think about those two things, qualifications and duties, it's possible that you could be qualified for a job but not able to do the duties of a job. That's possible. So maybe you have a high school diploma, maybe you have 5 years of work experience, thereby meeting the qualifications to work in a manufacturing plant, but maybe you can't perform the duties because you can't stand on your feet for 12 hours and you can't make repetitive movements. And conversely, it's possible to be able to do the duties of a job but not be qualified for the job. I'm thinking of, we all have those friends that they know an engine inside and out. If you ever have something wrong with your car, they're the person that you call. They can work on anything. So they can do the duties of the job, but maybe they're not qualified because they don't have an ASE mechanic certification. So in that case, they would be able to do the duties, but not be qualified. So at this point, you're probably wondering, Pastor Josh, where are you going? What are you talking about with all these jobs and qualifications and duties and all that? Well, this is where I'm going. In our text today, Hebrews 5, verses 1 through 10, the author, he writes about the job or the office of the high priest. In this Advent season, like I said, we're looking at the many roles of Jesus. And today we're going to see him as our great high priest. At this point already in this letter, the author of Hebrews has put forth and said plainly that Jesus is our great high priest. He's done it multiple times. I'm going to give you one example. Right before our text today, in Hebrews 4, verse 14, he says, or writes, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. I mean, it's clear. Jesus is our great high priest. Okay, so qualifications and duties. What am I talking about? Well, what we're going to do today, what we're going to do this morning, is we're going to look at what the qualifications, some of the qualifications and some of the duties are for the high priest, and we're going to see how that points us to Jesus. Our text today, if you look at your notes, it's really divided into two parts. In verses 1 through 4, we are given some of the duties and some of the qualifications of the high priest. And then it's really cool because in verses 5 through 10, what happens is in reverse order, the author of Hebrews, he shows us how Jesus fulfills these duties and he exceeds these qualifications. So that's my purpose this morning. What I want us to leave here with, what I want us to understand and walk away with, is that Jesus perfectly fulfills the duties and he exceeds the qualifications of the great high priest as the Savior of his people. That's the message. Jesus perfectly fulfills the duties and exceeds the qualifications of the great high priest as the Savior of God's people. So let's get going here. We're going to read first verses 1 through 4. It says, "For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was." So the first thing here we see is that the duty of a high priest, one of the things that he has to do is part of his job, it says in verse 1, was to act on behalf of men in relation to God. That's one of his duties. That's one of the vitally important tasks of the high priest. Sometimes one of the softened aspects of the gospel is this very thing. The message that I want to kind of bring to you today in terms of this duty is that sin has separated man from God. And we've been over this before, but God is holy and perfectly righteous. He's perfectly just. And all of mankind is corrupted. We are stained. We are marred by sin. From the moment that Adam and Eve, from the moment they ate of the fruit in the garden, man has been a rebel against God. We have broken that relationship with God. And because of sin and because of this broken relationship, there needs to be an intercessor. There needs to be somebody that mediates between sinful man and holy God. Sinful man, we cannot approach a holy God. We can't be in his presence. That's why we see when Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, when he sees the Lord face to face, that's why he cries out, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips." In that moment, Isaiah recognizes his sinfulness and that this is a holy, holy God. And so the priests, will see what they do is they intercede for God. That's one of their jobs. This act of intercession, it was one of the main duties of the Levitical priests, particularly the high priest. The high priest, he acted as this mediator between God and man. And we're told in verse 1 that this mediation, it was done through the offering of gifts and of sacrifices for sin. Through the sacrificial system of the Old Testament, God, what he did is he prescribed ways in which he was to be approached by sinful man through this mediation by the priests. Included in this prescription was how the priest could mediate for the sins of the people. Much of this description of the sacrificial system, it was very detailed. It was very exact. Much of it is contained in the book of Leviticus. I call the book of Leviticus the place that Bible reading plans go to die. Because as soon as you get to Genesis, we're cruising along, and then you get to Leviticus, and it's very exact, very detailed, and all of a sudden we forget to read that morning. But much of the book of Leviticus, it's dedicated to this description of this system and the duties of the priests. Okay? And some of these duties were offerings, like the grain offerings or the drink offerings. And these were gifts given to God as acts of worship by the people, but they had to be mediated or given, performed by the Levitical priests. In addition to the offerings, God also prescribed here how the sins of his people were to be dealt with through the offering of sacrifice, animal sacrifice. This is most specific or most clear, I guess, in Leviticus 16, as God tells Moses in detail that his brother Aaron, the high priest, was to perform certain sacrifices to ceremonially make amends or atone for the sins of the people, specifically on the Day of Atonement, this once-a-year day where the sins would be dealt with. In these offerings, in these gifts, in these sacrifices, the priests, they became mediators between God and man. The duties of the priests, and it's specifically at times the high priest, it was to perform these ceremonial tasks. That's what they were to do. That's part of the job description of the high priest. That's the main job of the high priest. And so as ridiculous as this is going to sound, if there was a job listing for high priest on Indeed.com, that duty would be you need to act as a mediator between God and man through the offering of sacrifices and all of this, because mankind is sinful. That's his duty. Verse 2 says about the high priest, he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. And so here we get another duty of the high priest. One of the things that the high priest is going to have to do in order to fulfill his job is to deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, to be compassionate. We've already discussed that the reason the high priest has to be this mediator between God and man is because of mankind's sin. Sinful man, that is the ignorant and the wayward. The ignorant and the wayward, they are the clientele of the high priest. Sinners. Think about it. The Levitical priesthood and this whole sacrificial system that I was talking about, they were formally established at a point in time in history when the people of Israel, they were fleeing Egypt and they were wandering through the desert. Think back to those stories in Exodus. How did that go? This whole wandering in the desert. Well, in one moment, they would be reveling in God, and the next moment, they would be rebelling against God. Reveling and rebelling. The people, they would revel in God's provision. And in the very next moment, they would cry out, Moses, what are you doing? You've brought us out in the desert. We're going to die. We have no food. We have no water. And then in one big instance, remember God, he provides manna. Do you remember that? The bread from heaven. And ironically, it's only a few short chapters later that we see the people at the foot of Mount Sinai making 2 golden calves to worship. Reveling and then rebelling. God himself, he refers to sinful Israel at this point as a stiff-necked people. And it's right after that this whole priesthood is established. That's when this priesthood comes about. These stiff-necked people, these ignorant and these wayward, sinful man, these are the ones that the high priest has to make intercession for. Yet, and this is the point, he's making intercession for the ignorant and wayward, yet one of the duties of the high priest is to be gentle towards them. So thinking about job descriptions, how would that be for a job description? Listen, you're going to have to deal with the sinful, the ignorant, the wayward. That's who you have to serve. It's going to be difficult. They're going to rebel against God. They're going to rebel against you. But even still, you're going to need to be gentle towards them. Be compassionate towards them. Be sympathetic towards them. If I'm reading that job description, I am not applying for that job. But those are the duties of the high priest. And in these first 2 verses here, we're also given one of the qualifications of the high priest. Just remember the qualifications are those prerequisites, those requirements that need to be met in order for someone to get the job. And usually if you meet the requirements, it ensures that the person, he's going to be able to perform the duties of the job. So why will the high priest be able to perform the duties of the job? Why will he be able to be gentle and compassionate towards the people? Well, verse 2 tells us that he can deal gently with them. And then it says, since he himself is beset with weakness. Since he himself is beset with weakness. The high priest, he's able to fulfill this duty because he's like them. He's like them. He's a man. The very beginning of our text today, it says this in verse 1. It says, for every high priest chosen among men. The mediator between God and man, it wasn't some statue. It wasn't some idol. It wasn't some angel. The mediator between God and man had to be a man. That's one of the qualifications. And he had to be a man so that he could sympathize with them, that he could be compassionate towards them. He could deal gently with them because he's able to relate and he's able to understand because he himself is a man. And because he's a man, since the high priest was also a sinful man, he also needed to have his sins atoned for. That's why it says in verse 3, because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. I referenced Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement earlier to show how the high priest offered up a sacrifice to deal with the sins of the people. However, in the very beginning of Leviticus 16, what it says there is that before the high priest can offer the bull for the sins of the people, he has to first offer a bull for his own sins. His own sins need to be dealt with. And so what we have here is sinful man interceding for sinful men before a holy God. That's what we have. And not only is the duty of the high priest to offer sacrifices for the sins of the people, he has to do it for himself as well. He's beset with weakness. And also in verse 4, we're given the second qualification of the high priest as we come to the end of this whole job description here. It says, and no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. The people, they were freed from the bondage of Egypt, and about the time that they're near Mount Sinai, God gives Moses instructions about this tabernacle, this place where God would come and dwell with his people. And as he's giving these instructions, he says to Moses, in Exodus 28, he says this. He says, then bring near to you Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him from among the people of Israel to serve me as priests. Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu and Eleazar and Ithamar. God calls Aaron and his offspring to be his priests. God calls them. Moses didn't just automatically one day wake up and say, hey, Aaron's going to be the high priest. Aaron didn't just one day shout out, hey, I'm the high priest. The people of Israel, they didn't take a secret ballot vote and vote in Aaron as the high priest. It's not what happened. God called Aaron and his offspring to act in the role of priest, to be this mediator between God and man. God set them apart to act in this role. Specifically, God called the men of the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi, they were to act as the priests. And so one of the qualifications, one of the prerequisites or the conditions for becoming the high priest was you had to be called by God. You had to be appointed by God. And so there it is. There's some duties and there's some qualifications. I don't know if you caught them all, so let's go through them here just real quick. In verses 1 through 4, we see that the duties of the high priest, they are to act as a mediator between a holy God and sinful man. And he does this through offerings and sacrifices. And then in addition to this, it's also the high priest's duty to deal gently with sinful man. So those are the two duties that we saw. And then we're also given the qualifications of the high priest. To be qualified to serve as the high priest, he needs to be a man. He has to be a man. In order to do the job of dealing gently with sinful man, you need one who is a man, because he can have compassion. He can sympathize with them. And then the final qualification is that in order to be the high priest, you must be called by God to that position. An individual, somebody couldn't just simply declare themselves to be a priest. This is a divine appointment. This divine appointment, it confirms and it ensures God's acceptance of these men. The high priest is a man, and he's a man called and accepted by God. Those are the qualifications, okay? Those are the qualifications and those are the duties, but this is the cool part. This is where it gets interesting to me. As we move into verses 5 through 10, what's going to happen is the author of Hebrews, he's going to bring this home by showing that it is the God-man. It is Jesus Christ that perfectly fulfills these duties, and he exceeds these qualifications. It's actually really cool. So let's begin looking at that in verses 5 through 6. It says, "So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' As he says also in another place, 'You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.'" So just remember, right before this in verse 4, we're told that in order to be qualified as the high priest, one needed to be called by God to that appointment, just as Aaron was. Well, verse 5 shows that like Aaron, Jesus was appointed as high priest by God. This was a divine calling. Not only does Jesus meet this qualification of being appointed by God, he exceeds it. The author, he quotes here Psalm 2:7. He says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And he attributes this to Jesus. And so what we need to see here, what's being conveyed in this, is that Jesus is not merely a man that meets a qualification. He exceeds that qualification. He goes beyond that qualification because he's the very begotten Son of God. Remember last week in Hebrews 1, verse 3, we read that Jesus, speaking of Jesus, he is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. Jesus, as the Son of God, he exceeds the qualification of being called by God because he is God. You see, he exceeds that qualification. And then in verse 6 it says, as he says in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." This is another way in which Jesus exceeds the qualification of being called to act as high priest. Jesus is the greater Aaron. Aaron was the high priest. He is the greater Aaron. The Levitical priesthood through Aaron, it was just a shadow that the whole time pointed to the priesthood of Jesus Christ. We're told later in Hebrews 7 that the priesthood has changed. If we were to continue on, that's what it says in Hebrews 7, that the priesthood has changed. How has it changed? What's different about Christ's priesthood? Well, as it says here in verse 6, it is forever. It is eternal. While the Levitical priesthood of Aaron was temporary, the priesthood of Jesus Christ is forever. And that point, it's pushed even further. It's reinforced here as the eternal priesthood of Jesus is compared to, or it's attached to, this figure Melchizedek. Who's heard of that name before, Melchizedek? He's an interesting person in Scripture. There's a lot of conjecture about who this Melchizedek is. Once again, Pastor Josh has his own belief, and someday if you want to know, I'll tell you. But for our purposes now, I just want to limit our scope of talking about Melchizedek to why he's mentioned here, particularly why this reinforces the idea of Jesus's priesthood being eternal. Okay? Melchizedek, this guy, this mysterious figure, he's only mentioned twice in the Old Testament. He first arrives on the scene in Genesis. If you remember the story of Lot, Lot was Abraham's nephew, and Lot lives in Sodom. And one day, some of the kings from the surrounding area, they come into Sodom, and they take away everybody in Sodom. They take them away as captives. Well, Lot's uncle Abraham, he hears about this, and he gives chase, and eventually he overtakes these kings and conquers these kings and takes all of these captives. He takes them back. And as he's coming back, he's met by this figure, this guy, Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is described as the king of Salem and as well as a priest of the God Most High. Melchizedek, he brings bread and wine to Abraham, and Abraham, this is kind of important, Abraham gives him a tithe, an offering. So why is that significant to our subject here? Well, in order to be a priest like Aaron, you had to be from the tribe of Levi. From the tribe of Levi. Was Jesus from the tribe of Levi? No. He was from the tribe of Judah. And so here, what's happening is the author of Hebrews, he attaches the priesthood of Jesus not to that temporary priesthood of Levi, but to this greater, superior priesthood of Melchizedek. Melchizedek was before Levi. You see, he preceded Levi. Later in Hebrews 7, it said that as Abraham offered a tithe here, that in some way, Levi, who was the offspring of Abraham, was also offering a tithe to Melchizedek. That Melchizedek is greater and superior to Levi. So therefore, as Jesus' priesthood is attached to that of Melchizedek, you see, it reinforces to these Jewish Christians that would be reading this letter that this is a superior priesthood than that of Levi's. The whole book of Hebrews, I spoke about this last week. Remember, the whole book of Hebrews was written and is focused on the central fact that Jesus is greater. The author, he wants this specific group of Jewish Christians to not return back to Judaism. That's what his goal is. Aaron and every other priest of the Levitical priesthood, they were temporary, but the author is saying now there's a much greater priest, an eternal priest. So we see that Jesus, he not only meets the requirement of being chosen by God, but he exceeds it because he is God in the flesh and he has an eternal priesthood. He exceeds it. Jesus truly is greater. And the point is that the recipients of this letter, they cannot return to a temporary and insufficient priest. That's what the author is trying to tell them. Likewise, I would submit to you as well that if Christ is your high priest, you cannot return to your former way of life. You have a much, much greater high priest. You can't go back to trying to make yourself clean. You can't go back to striving for your own righteousness. People, we fall into this trap sometimes, I think, of thinking and weighing their sin up and against the good things they do, as if there's this scale, right? And in the balances are your sin and your good things. And if we can just get those to balance out, we'll be okay. But here's the thing. You can never do enough good things to balance that scale out. You can never do enough good things. But the amazing thing is, this is the wonderful part, you don't have to. Because you have a great high priest who has done it for you. If Jesus Christ is your righteousness, you have this great priest, and he has done it all. In him, you are made right before God. You are to never return to a works righteousness. Never return to a works righteousness. Rather, what you should do is rest and be motivated to do good works because you have a blood-bought righteousness. This is a works righteousness versus a blood-bought righteousness. It's far, far superior. The other qualification of being a high priest is that he be a man. Remember, we said that he needed to be a man. In verses 7 through 8, that's exactly what the author is going to draw our attention to. Look at these verses. It says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Notice there that verse 7, it starts off with, in the days of his flesh. This is in reference to Jesus, when Jesus became a man. That's what we celebrate this Christmas season, right? Is Jesus' incarnation, Jesus taking on flesh. In order to be qualified, the high priest, he had to be a man, and in the incarnation, we have God taking on flesh, becoming a man. That's what Jesus did. He wrapped himself in humanity, becoming fully God and fully man. And thereby he not only fulfills this qualification, but he exceeds it. And that is the point. Jesus, the great high priest, he fulfills and he exceeds all the qualifications, every single one of them, because he's not only a man, but he is God, yet fully man. If you remember, one of the reasons that the high priest was to be a man was because he would need to perform that duty that was described. That duty earlier that we talked about of dealing gently with the ignorant and the wayward. Only a man can truly sympathize with a man. Already twice in Hebrews, this has been spoken of. Look at this. This is cool too. Look at these verses. Hebrews 2, verse 18, it says, speaking of Jesus, it says, "For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted." And then again in Hebrews 4:15, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." You see, it was necessary. It was essential that Jesus become a man. Verses 7 through 8, they speak of this reality, this necessity. In becoming man, Jesus truly suffered as a man, yet he suffered perfectly. Jesus, he was always within the will of the Father. The text states here that as a man, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. We see no greater example of that than the Garden of Gethsemane on Jesus' way to the cross. Jesus, he prayed to the Father with tears, you remember. He cried out, "Father, let this cup pass from me." As a man, Jesus truly suffered. Make no mistake about that. Jesus truly suffered. Remember, he told his disciples that were with him that he was sorrowful, even to the point of death. He suffered. Jesus can deal gently with man because he knows what it is to be a man. He knows what it is to suffer. He knows what it is to be tempted. Jesus can sympathize. He can deal gently. He can have compassion because he knows what it is to be a man. As we've said, Jesus, we've said this already, he exceeds the qualification that the high priest is a man because he's not only a man, but he is also a son. A son. Verse 8 says, "Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered." He learned obedience through what he suffered. That's kind of a difficult thing that people get hung up on. Jesus had to learn obedience. Well, this is not suggesting that Jesus was disobedient and he was rebellious and that he had to learn obedience. He wasn't some wayward and rebellious child that was prone to disobedience. That's not what they're saying. I think what's being said here, this is what's being said, is that in his humanity, Jesus went from an untested and kind of more theoretical obedience to an experiential, a proven, a tested obedience. He put his money where his mouth was. He proved it. Jesus was able to sympathize and have compassion on sinful man, not only because he, as God, created them and knows every single cell that's in your body, but once again, because he knows what it is, he experienced what it is like to be truly man. And I'm kind of belaboring that point because I think that this should be a great comfort to you. This should be a great encouragement to you. Jesus, he knows what it is to be tempted and to suffer. And I know many in here. I know your stories. I know what's going on in your life. And there are many of us today that are going through trials and temptations and suffering and despair. But you can be comforted. You can be comforted because you have a great high priest who has suffered, who has been tempted. He knows what you are going through. He can deal gently with you. He can have compassion on you. He can sympathize with you. He knows you. He knows everything that you're going through. He knows it in real time, but he has also experienced it. that should be a comfort to you. And not only is that a comfort, but it's an example for us too. Jesus, it says, was tempted and he suffered, but through it he learned obedience. Through this suffering, he learned obedience. So my question, I guess, at this point is, are your temptations and your sufferings, are they teaching you obedience? This is going to sound really strange, this sentence I'm about ready to say, but it's true. Suffering is a gift of God's grace. I'm going to say it one more time because I know that it sounds foreign. Suffering is a gift of God's grace. And this is what I mean. Through suffering, your faith is proven. Your faith is strengthened. Your faith is tested. Let me give you a verse here. 1 Peter 1, verses 6 through 7. It says, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Trials and suffering, believe me, they serve a purpose. And the obedience of Christ, that is our great example of following the will of God, leaning into God even in the midst of suffering. Looking past our present circumstances of suffering and temptation and trusting in a good and sovereign God who loves you and knows you. Learning obedience. So now our attention, it's turned to this great outcome of this suffering obedience. I think that we've established that there's qualifications and duties for the high priest, and that Jesus meets those duties and he fulfills those duties and he exceeds those qualifications, right? But what does it mean? What does it really mean? What's the outcome of that? That Jesus fulfills the duties and he exceeds the qualifications? Well, verses 9 through 10, our last two verses here, they tell us. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. This obedience through suffering of Jesus that we're talking about, it is culminated. It comes together in one place, and that's at the cross. At the cross, through his death, Jesus truly became the source of eternal salvation for all those who would trust in him. All those that would be united to him through faith. The duty of the high priest, remember, was to mediate between a holy God and sinful man. And this was accomplished perfectly and completely and fully at the cross, as Jesus cried out, "It is finished." The Levitical priesthood, it was temporary. It was not only temporary, it was insufficient. Hebrews 10:4 says, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. It's impossible. Only one that is fully God and fully man, one who is called by God from the foundation of the world, nonetheless, could be the perfect and final sacrifice. There's only one mediator between God and man, and that is the God-man, Jesus Christ. In this passage today, I hope you see this, the gospel is on full display. So just follow me here. Entertain me just for a second. God is perfectly holy and righteous, correct? He created man after his own image, and to be in relationship with him, man, we sinned, and we did that which was forbidden to do by eating of the fruit in the garden. What we were doing in that moment was questioning God and his goodness and his sovereignty. And in that moment, mankind became spiritually dead, and we rebelled against a holy God. Remember, Adam, he hid himself from God, thereby breaking that relationship, separating himself from God. The holiness of God, it cannot be in the presence of sinful man, so what does God do? God casts man out of the garden. But ultimately, because God is so gracious, he provides and prescribes a way for man to approach him through the priesthood. That was an act of grace. The priest, specifically the covering of sins by the high priest on that one day, on the Day of Atonement. He makes a way. God is so gracious, he makes a way in which the high priest would act as a mediator between sinful man and God. And this is all a shadow that points to a greater high priest. This great high priest, he exceeds the qualifications of high priest because he's not only a man, but he's God. He was not only called to this appointment, he was called before the foundation of the world, as I said. And since he met the qualifications of the high priest, he's able to fulfill the duties of the high priest. He's able to fulfill the duties, acting gently towards sinful man. He knows what it is to suffer and to be tempted because he's experienced it himself. And this all culminates in Jesus. This all finds its final form in Jesus, the great high priest of God's people, when he is led to the cross. The main duty of the high priest is to mediate between God and man, right? And this is done perfectly and completely as Jesus Christ takes upon himself the sins of God's people. At the cross, Jesus' blood was spilled. The high priest, you remember, they mediated through the blood of bulls and goats and other animals. Jesus reconciled people to God by his own blood. It's far different, much greater, much more superior. This is a once and for all sacrifice. This is it. Jesus perfectly fulfills the duties and he exceeds the qualifications of the great high priest as the Savior of God's people. He is the perfect applicant. He's the only one that could ever fill this job. So the question this morning is he your high priest? Is he your high priest? Are you counted among God's people? Do you call Jesus Lord and Savior? If you do, I would say be bold, be courageous, be encouraged, be comforted, because you have this great high priest who knows you, who loves you, who cares for you. Rejoice in that. But unfortunately, the opposite's always also true. If you're here today and you don't yet know Jesus as your high priest, and I know this is going to sound harsh, well, the wrath of God, it still rests upon you. You need a mediator. You need a mediator, and that mediator is Jesus Christ. What you must do is repent of your sin and believe in Jesus Christ for your righteousness. That's what you must do. You must count and look to him, his obedient life, his sacrificial death, his conquering resurrection. That is the only way. He's the only way we can be reconciled to a holy God. So if you don't know him, do not wait. Come to him now. Today is the day of salvation. We have a great, great high priest, Jesus, the greatest high priest of them all. Let's pray.